艾玛 Emma 是《傲慢与偏见》的作者简奥斯汀 Jane Austen 的另一篇长篇小说。艾玛是个上流社会的富家女，在她的村庄海伯里举足轻重。她善良、热心自负。文章描述了当时英国社会的爱情婚姻。该作品被多次搬上荧幕。
Chapter 14 More Than a Friend. Emma knew now that her own happiness depended on Mr. Knightley and his feelings for her. Emma had no hope that Mr. Knightley loved her. She could only hope for his respect. Emma could not think of marriage herself because she could never leave her father. But when she thought of Mr. Knightley marrying Harriet, or anyone else, she became very unhappy. Mr. Knightley was Emma's friend, and he had always told her the truth. She could not think of her life without his friendship and advice. Mr. Knightley was still in London, but he would soon be home. Emma would then have to see Mr. Knightley and Harriet together. Until then, she did not wish to see Harriet at all. Emma wrote to her friend and asked her to stay away from Hartfield for a time. Mrs. Weston was the next visitor to Hartfield, and she had more to tell Emma about Frank Churchill and Jane Fairfax. For a few hours, Mrs. Weston's interesting story stopped Emma thinking about Harriet and Mr. Knightley. Mrs. Weston had been to see Jane Fairfax, and she had invited Jane out for a drive in the Westons' carriage. At first, Jane had refused, but then she had agreed to go with Mrs. Weston. The two ladies had had a long conversation. Jane has not had a happy moment since she agreed to the secret engagement. This is what she told me, Mrs. Weston said. She knew that the secret engagement was wrong, but her love for Frank was the first thing in her mind. She depended on Frank for her future happiness. Jane and Frank had quarrelled about their engagement several times, Mrs. Weston went on. Jane knew that it was wrong to keep it a secret, but Frank refused to agree with her. He knew that the engagement would have made Mrs. Churchill very angry. Frank wanted to be happy, and he was at first. He could not understand Jane's feelings. But Jane is happy now, Emma, Mrs. Weston went on. She thanks you for your kindness to her. I have not been kind enough, Emma said. I could have been a better friend to Jane Fairfax. Emma now had the rest of the day to think about her own mistakes. It was July, but the weather was cold and wet. Emma could not go out, and the bad weather made Mr. Woodhouse feel ill. It was an unhappy day at Hartfield. Emma now believed she would never have happiness in the future. Only other people would be happy. When Mrs. Weston's baby was born, she would have less time to spend with Emma. Frank Churchill and Jane would be married, and they would go to live in Yorkshire. Mr. Knightley would be happy with Harriet, and he would have no reason to visit Hartfield every day. Emma would have plenty of time to understand her own feelings and become a better person. The next morning, the bad weather continued, but in the afternoon the sun shone. Emma decided to go for a walk. She was in the garden when she saw Mr. Knightley walking towards her. He smiled, and they walked along together. Mr. Knightley said nothing. Emma felt that she had to speak. I have some news to tell you, she said. It will surprise you. What is your news? Mr. Knightley asked. The very best kind. News of a wedding, Emma replied. If you are talking about Miss Fairfax and Frank Churchill, I know already, Mr. Knightley said. Mr. Weston wrote to me this morning and told me everything. The news was not a surprise to me. It may not have been a surprise to you, but it was to me, Emma said quietly. I could not believe it. I have been very silly. I have not understood anything. Mr. Knightley stopped walking and looked at Emma kindly. You are sad now, he said. Frank Churchill has behaved very badly to you, Emma, but he will soon be far away from Highbury. You will be able to forget him one day. I feel sorry for Jane Fairfax. She should have someone better than Frank Churchill. Mr. Knightley, Emma replied, you are wrong about me. I have never loved Frank Churchill. He flattered me and paid a lot of attention to me. But that was to hide his secret love for Jane. I did not understand that. I have been very silly, and I hope that they will both be very happy together. I have never liked Frank Churchill, but he is a very lucky man, Mr. Knightley said. He has behaved very badly, and everyone loves him. He is loved by a beautiful young woman who is both clever and good. He made her unhappy, but she was true to him. His aunt died, and he is no longer dependent on her for his future happiness. He now has money, and he is free. He can marry whoever he wants, and he is still young, only 23. He will have a happy future. Frank Churchill is a very lucky young man. You do not sound happy, Mr. Knightley, Emma said. Do you envy Frank Churchill? There is one thing that makes me envy him, Mr. Knightley said. Emma did not answer. Perhaps you do not want to know why I envy Frank Churchill, Mr. Knightley went on. But I must tell you. Do not say anything that will make you unhappy, Emma cried. Well then, I shall be silent, Mr. Knightley replied. Emma saw that he was very upset. You can speak to me as a friend, Mr. Knightley, Emma said quietly. Tell me what you want to say. Then I will speak, but not just as a friend, Mr. Knightley replied. My dear Emma, have I any hope of being more than a friend to you? Emma could not answer. Your silence does give me hope, Mr. Knightley said. But my dearest, dearest Emma, please tell me now, at once. You might say no, but I must hear your answer. Emma was too happy to speak. If I loved you less, I could talk about it more, Mr. Knightley said. I am not a clever talker like Frank Churchill, but I have always told you the truth, and I am telling you the truth now. It is time for you to tell me what you think, dearest Emma. Then Emma found the right words to say, and she said them. In the next half hour, Emma and Mr. Knightley talked about everything. They talked about mistakes and quarrels and love. When Emma and Mr. Knightley returned to the house together, their happiness was perfect. Mr. Woodhouse was glad to see Mr. Knightley again. He asked him all about his visit to London. Mr. Woodhouse did not know that his good friend was planning to marry his daughter and take her away from him. Emma did not sleep well that night. She was very happy. But there were two people who would not like her news, her father and Harriet. How could Emma tell her father about her engagement? And how could she tell Harriet? Emma and Mr. Knightley could become engaged, but Emma knew that she could never leave her father. While Mr. Woodhouse was alive, she could never marry and leave Hartfield. Harriet Smith was a different problem. In the morning, Emma wrote her young friend a letter. She told Harriet what had happened. A servant took the letter to Mrs. Goddard's school. Emma also wrote a letter to her sister Isabella. Emma asked Isabella to invite Harriet to stay with her. It would be better for Harriet to leave Highbury. If Harriet lived in London for a few weeks, she would forget her love for Mr. Knightley more quickly. Mr. Knightley came to Hartfield for breakfast. He saw that Emma was sad from writing the letters, but before he left, she was happy again. At midday, a parcel arrived from Randalls. Inside this parcel there was a short letter from Mrs. Weston, and a very long letter from Frank Churchill to the Westons. Mrs. Weston's note said, "Mr. Weston and I would like you to read Frank's letter. We have forgiven him. We want our friends to understand him and to forgive him too." Emma read Frank's letter quickly. She knew most of the story already from Mrs. Weston, but towards the end of the letter she learnt something new. "I behaved very badly at Box Hill," Frank had written. "I talked to no one but Miss Woodhouse. I wanted to make Jane jealous. I thought that Miss Woodhouse had guessed the truth about Jane and myself, and I thought that she would understand. Jane was cold to me that day because I behaved badly. I made her very unhappy, and I did not talk to her again that day because I left for Richmond. After the visit to Box Hill, Jane wrote me a letter. She told me that she was ending our engagement. Her letter arrived on the day that Mrs. Churchill died. Of course I answered Jane's letter at once, but I had to make many arrangements after Mrs. Churchill's death. I am afraid that my letter to Jane was not sent. A few days later, when Jane had not received a reply from me, she wrote to me again. She returned all my letters. She also asked me to return all the letters that she had written to me. I told my uncle everything, and hurried back to Highbury. Thank God I was not too late. My dearest Jane is now dearer to me than ever. I know that Jane is a much better person than I am. I cannot believe that she loves me. I am a very lucky man. Your loving son, F.C. Weston Churchill. When Mr. Knightley next came to Hartfield, Emma showed him the letter and asked him to read it. "I would rather talk to you, Emma, but I will read it," he said. "What a long letter that young man has written." Mr. Knightley read the letter quickly, and was specially interested in the parts about Emma herself. "So Frank Churchill spent all his time talking to you so that Jane would be jealous," Mr. Knightley said angrily. "He thought that you had guessed his secret, and he thought that you would understand. All he ever thought about was himself. And it was Frank Churchill who sent the piano to Jane Fairfax." "I thought so," said Mr. Knightley. "Only a very thoughtless young man would have sent a gift like that to Highbury." "Well, this last page shows that Mr. Churchill is very fond of Miss Fairfax," Knightley said. "Jane Fairfax is much too good for him, as he says, but he does seem to love her. I agree with him. He is a very lucky young man." Mr. Knightley gave the letter back to Emma. "Let us now talk about something else," he said. "I have had enough of Frank Churchill for one day." Mr. Knightley took Emma's hand and held it in his own. "Emma, I have been thinking about your father," Mr. Knightley said. "I know what you want to tell me. You want to say that our marriage is impossible. It is impossible because it would make your father too unhappy. If you tell him that you want to leave Hartfield, he will never agree. He will not agree to live with us at Donwell Abbey either. So this is my plan. After our marriage, I shall live with you and your father here at Hartfield. What do you say to that, my dearest Emma?" The more Emma thought about this plan, the better she liked it. Her father must soon be told about their engagement, but not just yet.